I'm Roniel,
I'm DaRon.
and today we have another interesting thing to talk about. Obviously, there was a conversation, I believe, on LinkedIn, right? We were talking about somebody was talking about was it insecure by default that they were talking about on
It was
LinkedIn?
both. It was insecure
Both.
by design and insecure by default. They have this software that allows you to upload arbitrary files by default. Now, they do have an option to filter the files by extension and things of that nature, but by default, it accepts all files and all file types. But this is for a web server.
Yeah.
And and that was by design and by default. And oh my God. We argued back and forth, and he kept saying, well, some people want it this way. And I kept saying, that's fine. You want to allow people to upload arbitrary files to your web server? Go for it. But that shouldn't be the default. And it's still insecure both by design and by default. And those are two separate things, right?
Yep. And why do you think that people actually try to make these things a feature? These are a feature, like instead of understanding that it is, a bug or an issue. It's insecure by default or
I,
design.
I think a large part of it is development teams will create a product without understanding the user or the use cases. And that's actually one of the worst things you can do. So they say, okay, so this, I want to make this so that anyone can use it in any application. And so I'm going to make it accept everything, right? What
Yeah.
they fail to understand is the way it's supposed to work is that you're supposed to have an audience in mind, you're supposed to have a purpose in mind, and you're supposed to build your software to that audience and to that purpose. You see it all the time. We've discussed before, but with Windows, they had the enabled by default anonymous shares, right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
anyone could go through and look at your files. Most of the time it was read only, but it depended on which version of Windows and a few other things. So you had by default insecure configuration. You now, because the default is insecure, had to, when you installed Windows, lock Windows down before you did anything else with it, before you connected it to anything.
Yep.
And it was also by design because they intended for this functionality to be there. And there's this misunderstanding that I have to accommodate everyone or no one will use my software.
Hey, I would say with that Windows thing back then, that would be my most common way to get in. If I couldn't get in the system, or like if you put in your boot disk and then overwrite
Mm-hmm.
everything and then have it back to like the password to blank, whatever you wanted to set, and then when it stopped working or whatever, I would say, okay, if this wasn't working on this particular system, they still have the anonymous login, so I can just
Right.
go ahead and log in anonymously.
Right. Right. Well, and exactly to your point, when you were actually on the machine, you could just hit cancel and it would go into a guest. You'd log in as
Yep.
guest.
Yep.
And that again is by design. By design, they said, okay, well, we should have this guest account and we should enable it and you should be able to authenticate to it. And it took a thorough thrashing before Microsoft started to understand that that's not the way to go. And there are a lot of reasons why that's not the way to go, right?
Yeah. Yep. Ton. Definitely a ton of reasons why it's not a way to go, especially if you got somebody like myself or somebody stole your computer. All they have to do is cancel, go in and get. Now, that may not mean that they might have admin rights or anything else, but there are always ways to circumvent those things. So um, that would be my common way if I was trying to get into a system to do that. Not saying I did, but I'm just saying in particular, that was just kind of easy. But then from there, you can go off and find ways to pivot. So, but that is not good. Same way with FTP, anonymous logins. Of course, no. Hopefully, nobody's using FTP anymore. But that's not a good thing. Like I remember a recent engagement. They had a Python FTP server that was it does it by design, and you can see all the files there, sensitive files, whatever, and that is not a good thing. I don't even know why they thought that was a great thing to do. No, my thing is and the biggest question I want to ask is, can you explain to the audience what insecure by default and what insecure by design is, and the differences between them two?
So, insecure by design is a principle wherein you design something in a manner that is insecure, knowing that you are purposely designing it that way. You don't necessarily know that you're designing it in an insecure way, but you purposefully build it so that it is the way that it is. I build my web server so that you can upload arbitrary files, and I did that purposefully. That's by design. Insecure by default is where I go through and I have a series of different options that you can enable to secure something. However, by default, those options are disabled. Good example, it used to be that the administrative account in Windows was enabled by default, and the guest account was enabled by default. And you would have to go through and disable those. So those were insecure by default because you could secure them, but you had to go through and lock them down. So you actually had two things there. You had that insecure by design because they intended for that guest account to be there. And you have insecure by default because by default that guest account, that anonymous account, is enabled. So two separate constructs that oftentimes wind up interleaving.
And that would be the same way like with S3 buckets, right? Like where Amazon, where they decided to make it secure by default.
Right.
And instead of allowing it to be insecure by default, where you had to go in and make sure your bucket wasn't public.
Right.
But, you know,
right.
Same idea, right? Yeah.
Right. A real perfect example exactly to that would be if we look at Amazon firewall. So the Amazon firewall, the inbound and the egress and ingress, or inbound and outbound traffic, is filtered. But the way they do it is that the inbound traffic by default is all filtered out. Your outbound traffic by default is not. They allow your systems to connect to anything and spew out anything. But by default, only certain things, nothing can communicate with any of your servers by default. And that's secure by default because I have to actually roll back security, so to speak, in order to enable functionality. In order to allow someone to connect to my web server, I have to explicitly allow that web server, that port, to be accessed by the outside world.
Yeah, so, and we might have touched a little bit on it, but I want to make sure again that with insecure by design, why do you think that developers are trying to get away with calling those things features? Like, why?
I think because in a lot of cases, developers don't understand why it's a bad thing, or because they keep kicking back. They have this nagging feeling that if they secure something by default, people will complain. If I go through and I require you to have a password on all accounts, Linux does this, for example, in order to, when you create a Linux account by default, in most distributions anyway, you have to have a password. And it has to be a certain character set, etc., a certain complexity by default. Now, you have a number of people who complain, oh, this is for my home computer, I don't need to do this. And the problem is developers are forgetting that who their user is going to be, or who the majority of their users are going to be. So if you're making, and how educated they are on the matter, just because someone complains that they don't like this functionality doesn't mean it's a valid complaint.
Right. That is true.
I may very well feel like Windows should allow me to anonymously connect to my root drive and do so with both read and write permissions across the entire drive, but that doesn't make that a valid feeling. That just means I'm ignorant of the reasons why that's wrong. And that's where you have to have the conversation with the development team about why this is a bad idea and discuss with them how this feature is, number one, not what people really want, especially in a corporate environment.
Yeah.
Going back to your FTP example, FTP, like you said, is insecure by design, and it's insecure by default. By design, they use clear text. The actual file transfer protocol, everything is clear text. That's why you then have SFTP and FTPS that came about. And then, of course, SCP and so on and so forth. So by design, everything is clear text. So by design, it's insecure. By default, many FTP servers, at least used to, allow anonymous authentication. Now, that may be a feature that people want and that is useful, but by default, you should have that disabled. And you may ask why, right? Why should I have this disabled by default? And the reason is, and this has been illustrated for at least 30 years, most users will not know enough to properly secure the system.
Yeah, they don't. Then how many people are reading the documentations?
Yes.
Like how many sysadmins are sitting down reading documentation? So, and then fully understanding what they're actually reading and digesting that. So yes, it saves the company time and being, attacked, or actually somebody getting in and breaching their system to do something so simple that they didn't even know that they needed to secure. So
right.
It makes it better. And then another thing to that point, and also for when you were saying that the root drive thing about Microsoft allowing you to anonymously, if that's something you wanted to have as a feature, right? You have people that would say that they would want these things, or that they're fine with that, but then as soon as they get breached, then it's a problem.
Yes.
So
yes,
it caused, it stops the company who's designed the product from having an issue. So if you set it by secure by default or secure by design, then it's their problem if they unset that, or if they was to, I don't want that. Right. I want it back the way it should be, or it should be this way. Then that's the company's fault. That's not your fault, because in your documentation, you have these set. And if they wanted to go do these, this is how they disable that. But that is not on you now, that is on the company.
Right. You're exactly right. And to that point, it is absolutely vital that everyone remember litigation is a real thing. And at least in the United States, you have the potential for someone suing you for gross negligence if your software was insecure by default, if your software was insecure by design, because they can go up in front of a jury and say, look, this is a practice that ended in the early 2000s. This was a practice that very quickly, with the explosion of people, easy access to the internet, has generally been shut out. And we saw the Log4j stuff. So you remember Log4j? Yeah. That was insecure by design and insecure by default. By design, they allowed you to go through and make JNDI calls. That was purposeful and by design. By design, they allowed you to make Kubernetes and Docker calls. By design, they allowed you to pull JVM data and a whole host of other system data from the system through these logging calls. It was all purposeful. It wasn't an accident that the code was built that way. And their Git logs reflect this, and their manuals reflect this. That was all by design. And by default, that functionality was all enabled. They had a little flag starting with, I think it was 2.11 or something like that. They put in a little flag that would disable that, but it was enabled by default. And so you had that insecure by design because they intended that functionality, and then insecure by default because by default that functionality, that bad malicious functionality, was enabled. And there was no legitimate reason for that. Zero legitimate reason for that. But it's incredibly common to see, especially in the open source world, because they don't oftentimes know their audience. right? They're making this library or this tool for anyone and everyone. And again, there's that mentality of, since I don't know my audience, I'm going to make this as easy to use as possible with as little configuration as possible.
Yeah. And that just becomes an issue. Like, you know what I'm saying? Especially when you're creating software nowadays, that you have to think about, you know, securing your products, you know, and because people are buying these or using these products, and if they're compromised, then it's on you, you know. And that's why, you know, we as penetration testers or cybersecurity professionals, when we're doing these assessments and finding these different things, and then you tell the developers, hey, this is an issue because attackers could use your application to pivot in somebody's system, to compromise somebody's system, and now you have a whole slew of bull crap to deal with because you didn't take the time to secure your product. And that should be done way before the product is even put into production, you know. And down the line, we'll talk a little bit more about threat modeling and how you do this, you know, in a life cycle, you know, and how this should be implemented. And I know people have heard this all before, but they still do not implement it into their life cycle. So if you do this right, then you won't have a problem. And I'm not saying nothing's 100% secure, but still, if you're doing these things all the time and these steps, then you'll really be compromised or be in the news like most people. You'll at least be able to, you know, attempt to prevent these things. So this is just a segment on understanding what insecure by default and insecure by design is and the differences, and why you should actually make sure that you utilize those so you won't have some of the issues or be in the newspaper like some companies, you know. But if you haven't already, please like, comment, and subscribe. Let us know if you like this content or want more of this content. And you can email us, you can comment down below. You can always talk shit to DaRon if you want. Feel free, because he needs some water. I know you guys couldn't see that, but it's messing up everything. But into the next episode later.
Have fun. I'm DaRon. Oh, you're playing with your eyes.
Sorry, my. Well, at least you didn't say.
I was about to say. I finally get my damn name right.